When we talk about pregnancy
Right,
in the war zone, we
Earth.
really need
This is
to
Adam
address
Sturch broadcasting
the issue
from the
of
Mushroom
trauma
Mansion,
in
Taos, New
pregnant
Mexico.
patients.
Working
And
on
actually,
oil
just
painting
before
butterfly.
coming here, I found out
Okay,
that
this
one
one's
of our
getting
pregnant
closer.
patients who was in the ICU had
But
passed
I would
away
like to see
yesterday.
the glaze
She was 5
develop
months
at least
pregnant
another layer or
and
two
sleeping
before I
in a
do the
tent,
final butterfly coat
and
and
bomb
detail.
was dropped in the area that's supposed to be a safe zone.
I want
So
this
she ended
water
up coming in with, extensive burns and
more so of what it is. I'm going to
explosive
increase the
injuries
density
with
of the
shrapnel
little
and
ripply
required
tiny lines
major surgery
throughout
for
the
burns with
highlights,
skin
probably the
grafts,
shadow area too,
major
and then we'll
surgery, abdominal surgery to
reglaze
get rid of
the
shrapnel.
shadows cast by
She
the
had lost
foreground
vision in one eye,
stone
and she was
island
intubated.
things,
She couldn't breathe on her own because of inhalation
the
from the smoke and fire.
entirety of the
So there was a
highlight
thought
area
that
of
she
the
would be
water
able
as
to pull
well.
through.
But
Oh,
to
and by the way,
start,
she was also 5 months pregnant, which
it's
was really
finer
hard
with
to
those
even
lines.
notice because she was so malnourished.
If I can get this
So
center.
I was consulted to come in and at least do an ultrasound and make sure the baby was alive, and before I left it was. And so I just found out yesterday as I was checking up on her, I found out this morning that she had passed away. And there's always hope that somebody will pull through. But the situations with the sanitation in Nasser Hospital, we also just heard as we were leaving on Monday morning that the clinical wound services for over 400 patients had to be suspended because the supplies had run out. So we're already dealing with, malnutrition and starvation because of the Israeli siege on food and supplies, affecting healing on a heavily traumatized patient population, including pregnant women. And now the services that were going to be withheld were the one thing that could get them to some healing with appropriate wound care.
I wanted to play for you the Israeli ambassador to the U.S., Yechiel Leiter, who claimed that the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu was flooding food into Gaza. As we know, Netanyahu has denied outright that there's starvation in Gaza. This is the Israeli ambassador.
We feel the same way. The Prime Minister feels the same way, and that's why he's taking every decision possible to have food flood into Gaza. As a matter of fact, right now as we speak, there's 636 trucks, semi-trailers, waiting to enter Gaza, and the UN agencies are not picking them up because of their argument with the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation. I appeal to the international community, to the media. I mean, look, there have been pictures that have been broadcast, even on CNN, I gotta say this, excuse me, but even on CNN, pictures of children who are suffering from cerebral palsy or cystic fibrosis, not from hunger. And yet we're condemned for it. This has a long history of pointing the finger at the Jewish state and really has to stop.
So that was the Israeli ambassador speaking earlier. So, the reference is to a New York Times cover story which showed the image of a child who appeared, in fact was, starving, but the Israelis said the story was misleading because the child actually had cerebral palsy. Now, Dr. Slimi, if you could explain, that argument, respond to what was said now, but also the fact that that child had cerebral palsy, but first of all, cerebral palsy patients don't necessarily look so enormously emaciated. And the claims that Israel is making about what's actually going on in Gaza.
I think that's a really interesting point that the government on one hand is saying one thing, and then in our experience, what we've seen firsthand as clinicians on the ground are seeing something completely different, that there is widespread starvation caused by the siege. We see it every day, we see it in our patients, and in children, not just with other conditions, but including cerebral palsy, they shouldn't be starving to death. So we have other children who don't have any other conditions who are also clearly starving from lack of nutritional food. And adults, and like I said, the caretakers that are supposed to be taking care of those who come in for care. I mean, how is this possible that they also are not getting nutritional food and starving and hungry?
And just to be clear, I mean, if you're suffering starvation and you get food, that doesn't mean you're going to be okay for the rest of your life. Can you talk about the effect of starvation on children, on adults?
Sure. based on what I know, again, it's not my area of expertise, but we know that many adults and children right now are in a stage 5 of the famine and starvation, and reintroducing food to a body that's been starved for months has to be done very carefully, and it can actually lead to somebody dying if it's not done appropriately, because you have lack of not just food. I mean, you can eat bread every day, but that's not enough to sustain development, healthy, brain development, body development. And I think that's the thing that you'll see even in kids now after being deprived for months. The siege that's happening in the last few months is an acute event on top of a chronic, already malnourished population. So it's, insults to injury. And again, these long-term effects of, developmental delay for kids, we see that, we know that's a possibility. How is it going to affect the adults long-term when they do eventually get a steady supply of food? And I think that we know that there's going to be chronic health conditions.
You've also worked in Ukraine. We just have 30 seconds, but the comparisons.
I mean, they're both tragic situations, but one thing I'll say is I have worked in both, and as a humanitarian physician, feel that it's important that we work where we can, where the populations need it. But the one thing I can say for Gaza that is different is that there's no safe place in Gaza. We hear it all the time. Being there, it was completely evident that there's no safe place in Gaza.
Dr. Ambreen Slimi, urogynecologist, executive director of the International Medical Response Foundation, just back this week from volunteering for several weeks at Nasser Hospital in Khan Yunis in Gaza. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman with Nermeen Sheikh.
On Wednesday, Canada became the latest country to announce plans to recognize a Palestinian state, joining recent calls by France and the UK. Prime Minister Mark Carney spoke in Ottawa.
Canada intends to recognize the state of Palestine at the 80th session of the United Nations General Assembly in September 2025. This intention is predicated on the Palestinian Authority's commitment to much-needed reforms, including commitments by the Palestinian Authority's President Abbas to fundamentally reform its governance, to hold general elections in 2026 in which Hamas can play no part, and to demilitarize the Palestinian state.
Israel blasted Canada's move, calling it a, quote, reward for Hamas. President Trump wrote on Truth Social, quote, that will make it very hard for us to make a trade deal with them. He was referring to Canada. Meanwhile, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and Egypt and other Arab nations have joined a call for Hamas to disarm and end its rule in Gaza. The countries signed on to a joint call agreed to at a UN conference here in New York, co-hosted by Saudi Arabia and France, to build support for a two-state solution. For more, we're joined by Mohammed Shahada, writer and analyst from Gaza. He's in Copenhagen, visiting fellow at the European Council on Foreign Relations. Mohammed, welcome back to Democracy Now! Talk about these political developments, both the UK, France, Canada saying they're going to recognize Palestine as a state, and then Saudi Arabia, Egypt saying that Hamas has to disarm.
Absolutely. Thanks, Amy, for having me. The first thing to emphasize is that this is no way a reward for Hamas. It proves hardliners within Hamas wrong when they say that nonviolence or advocacy do not work, diplomatic engagement is futile, and might makes right, violence is the only way. When you give Palestinian moderates victory of this symbolic nature to argue with their hardline peers and say, look, there is an alternative path, this is in no way a reward for Hamas. What is actually a gift to hardliners is the Trump administration, literally about 5 minutes ago, imposing sanctions on Palestinian Authority officials, PLO officials, for trying to seek justice through the international court system, the Court of Justice and Criminal Court, and saying that this is a step too far. In terms of these promises of recognition, it's largely symbolic. It's filled with caveats, loopholes, and qualifiers and conditions. Countries are deferring it until September, and some countries are saying we would recognize if Israel does not end the genocide in Gaza by then. But even then, even with these hesitant small steps, Israelis are saying this is dealing a significant amount of pain to the Israeli government. Yet Barak Ravid, one of the most prominent Israeli journalists, was saying yesterday that this is the worst diplomatic defeat Israel has suffered since its creation. And it is for three reasons. Number one, it's because the two-state solution is a conversation Israel does not want to have at all. Because once you begin to say, okay, let's move towards peace, Israel would see this as a peace offensive. That's literally a term that Israeli security strategist Abner Yaniv coined. And they would see it as a threat because that conversation would expose and lay bare who is the rejectionist party. Now you have consensus in the Israeli mainstream, wall to wall, including the opposition parties that are saying, like Yair Golan, Yair Lapid, Benny Gantz are saying there's not going to be any Palestinian state anytime soon. And you don't want to open that conversation because it is going to show that Israel is the one that's rejecting it. Like one of the reasons why Israel's propaganda is failing miserably, it's because Israel has gone too extreme that it became a political suicide for any Israeli diplomat or politician to even fake support for peace and the two-state solution. They would lose their jobs immediately. And the second reason is because Israel is trying to sell a fantasy of ethnic cleansing in Gaza and in the West Bank as the ultimate solution to the Palestinian question. To tell the Trump administration that the most humane thing we can do to Palestinians is to kick them all out of Gaza and turn it into a Riviera. But when you have countries that are saying, look, here's a solid political track that can end this occupation, end Israel's apartheid, allow both sides to live in peace. And that political track is endorsed by every single Palestinian political party, including Hamas. Hamas said, we will dismantle our arms, we will dismantle ourselves, lay down our arms if Israel ends the occupation. If you try to say, no, there is this alternative plan, Israel would be threatened by that. That's when even like Emmanuel Macron, the French president, he said in Singapore a month ago, he was saying something like, we will recognize Palestine on these multiple conditions, Hamas disarming, Hamas leaving Gaza, Hamas not having any political future. Israel panicked and immediately attacked him and called it a crusade because they see it as a threat. And the third fear is a snowballing effect. We see European governments that are saying recognition is not enough. It needs to be coupled with pressure on Israel, with sanctions, with penalizing measures to advance the Palestinian statehood to the end of the occupation. This morning, the Swedish Prime Minister, who is a right-wing coalition leader that is pro-Israeli for a very long time, was saying this morning, we need to impose these economic sanctions on Israel under the association agreement. So that's something that Israel is terrified of.
And so, Mohammed, just to go back to the question of recognition, only to point out that the state of Palestine is recognized by 147 of the 193 UN member states. So, if you could elaborate on, the position that France, the UK, and Canada have taken, the distinction between their position and the position the US is taking, because as you've pointed out, European governments have now moved from calling for the absolute destruction or dismantling of Hamas and Israel's right to do so, to calling on Hamas to hand over its weapons and ruling Gaza to the Palestinian Authority while leaving the door open for Hamas to join the PLO.
Absolutely. I mean, there's a significant shift here. European governments early on were saying Hamas needs to be dismantled, Hamas needs to be destroyed completely, and Israel has a right to do so. They now realize what the Trump administration has not come to realize yet. Trump and his team are still living in the fantasy that Hamas can be destroyed or it can be forced into surrendering. Whereas European governments are saying surrender is not going to happen, military defeat is not going to happen. The most extensive study in history on non-state armed actors was done by the Rand Corporation, I think in 2008, and they looked at groups like Hamas between the years 1968 until 2008, and they found that only 7% were defeated militarily, 43% through a political process. So that's why you see Western governments now saying that Hamas will not be forced into surrender, and Israel has failed to destroy Hamas militarily. The only way you can proceed forward is not a framework of capitulation, but one of decommissioning, like Northern Ireland, trying to get a process of Hamas disarming or laying down its arms hand in hand with a credible path towards Palestinian statehood. And that's what Israel sees as a threat, because Netanyahu is using it as a pretext to maintain an endless war in Gaza by saying we need to destroy Hamas while doing very close to nothing in that regard. They failed miserably. 22 months of unprecedented warfare in modern history since the Second World War. It did not defeat Hamas. but the pretext is still being used by the Israeli government, the Israeli military, to sustain the genocide in Gaza. So if you have countries that are offering them a way out, a way to climb down from the tree, a way to disarm Hamas, of course Israel and the US will react very harshly and in a very hostile manner to this.
It's been very interesting to see Trump disassociate himself from Netanyahu's remarks that there's no starvation in Gaza. Trump said otherwise. He saw the pictures, he said, on TV. They look hungry, he said. As he uses tariffs to attack countries politically, like he wants to protect the Bolsonaro in Brazil, who's on trial for attempting a coup, and he's going to impose 50% tariffs on Brazil, and attacks other countries like Canada for saying they're going to recognize a Palestinian state. What could he do when it comes to Israel? Of course, the U.S. has tremendous ties to Israel, providing massive amount of most of the weapons in Israel. If he really wanted to push Israel right now, after all, his negotiator, Witkoff, has just arrived in Israel, supposedly to jumpstart the so-called peace talks.
Well, there's this American perception that Netanyahu and Trump are very close allies and they love each other a lot. In Israeli media, which I read daily, you have a clear picture that Netanyahu and the Israeli government are terrified of Trump. They don't want to anger him. That's why as soon as Trump walked into office, Netanyahu immediately accepted the ceasefire proposal that's been on the table for 7 months or 6 months prior to Trump assuming office. He accepted immediately a temporary pause in Gaza, and then he tried to wiggle his way out of it. It's the same that you saw with Trump as soon as he wrote a single tweet telling Netanyahu, lay down your arms, stop bombing Iran. The ceasefire was instated immediately. And it's the same kind of pressure. All it would take is a single phone call from the Trump White House to Netanyahu and his government and saying, in the genocide in Gaza. But up until now, by the White House's own admission in Axios, Barak Ravid has been reporting on this, you see a consistency in the Trump White House of never trying to pressure Netanyahu at all on Gaza. At most, what they do is to tell him, the war is bad for you. You get to do whatever you want. We will keep giving you weapons and political cover and immunity. It's just not very good for your health. You make the right choice. And that is far from bringing a genocide to an end. The only thing it would take is Trump making a phone call to Netanyahu and saying, end this now. And that's something that Netanyahu is terrified about. Every time you see Trump making a statement that there is a breakthrough in the ceasefire negotiations in Gaza, you see Netanyahu taking a step back and allowing the Israeli team to go to Doha, to Qatar, and negotiate with Hamas until he bores Trump in the details and tires him mentally, and then the Israeli team is taken back, the blame is put on Hamas, and the genocide continues. It's the same dynamic over and over.
So, Mohammed, I just want to go to the comments that Trump made that perhaps were the most harsh, in a way, about the distance that he has, his position, compared to Netanyahu's position. He responded to questions about starvation in Gaza while speaking to reporters on Air Force One earlier this week on Tuesday.
I think everybody, unless they're pretty cold-hearted or worse than that, nuts, there's nothing you can say other than it's terrible when you see the kids. And those are kids, whether they talk starvation or not, those are kids that are starving. They are starving. And you see the mothers, they love them so much, and there's just nothing they seem to be able to do. They got to get them food, and we're going to get them food.
So, Mohammed, if you could respond very quickly to what Trump said and the fact that you've said a two-state solution, the conversation is basically dead in Israel. So what are they saying in the media there?
Well, basically, the Israeli fantasy is that Gazans are going to be pushed out and the West Bank would be next. Israel already started this process in Jenin and Tulkarem, over 42,000 people displaced already there. So they think they can start it in Gaza and then replicate it in the rest of the Palestinian territory. But with hunger and Israeli propaganda about this, you see a pattern of Israeli propaganda going to the utmost extremes, like with the GHF massacres. We saw it with our own eyes and ears on camera. We saw witness testimonies, Red Cross statements, Doctors Without Borders statements. And the Israeli talking point was, it never happened. not just trying to minimize it, but to deny it altogether. And Israeli propaganda at this point, it does not aim to make the case for Israel or persuade you of what is right, but it's rather to sow confusion, flood the zone with as much confusion as
All right,
possible.
that's getting a little
to
better.
tire people out
And some
mentally,
finer
train them
lines,
and push them away from the topic under the pretext of,
and more of
it's
them.
too complicated to follow up on this. What you see
Looking
with
a little
Trump
bit
is
more
basically
watery now.
we've reached to a point
I
of
think I'm going to cut this here and perhaps do a
conclusive
second
evidence
session
mass
of some
famine in
smaller
Gaza, that
lines,
you have the most notorious
are just to
Republican
saturate it a bit more.
pro-Israeli,
So,
lawmakers that are
take two
admitting
coming
their
up.
starvation.
South Korea
All
now
right,
saying
take two.
he's reconsidering Canada because they're considering a Palestinian state. What should we understand here?
I think the biggest takeaway is that what is actually being done by the President Donald Trump is the opposite of what candidate Donald Trump promised to attract working class voters, which was using tariffs and trade policy to rebalance trade, to rebuild our manufacturing, to create good jobs, making the things we need to be safe here at home. None of that is what's happening. Instead, first of all, you've got total random chaos. It's on, it's off. That's actually chilling investment. So some of the factories, new factories that were being constructed under the previous administration, the construction has been chilled because businesses have no idea what next week is going to be his whim. Number two, you're seeing this horrible combination of sort of Trump's own personal flattery, grudges, whims, and kind of like the George W. Trump administration as far as these deals, which are not written down, are unclear how real they are, but to the extent he's touting them, what we know about them is that, for instance, the big demands, the priorities are for big tech to get rid of other countries' anti-monopoly rules or privacy policies, for big pharma to raise medicine prices, for big oil to buy more U.S. carbon-based fuels. Meanwhile, on the actual trade front, we see the administration actually starting to cave in on the pre-existing Biden-era trade policies on China, because Trump so wants to have actually a summit meeting with the president of China and be flattered there. And then the places he is putting in tariffs, you mentioned this, the tariffs on Brazil actually went into effect yesterday. The highest tariffs we have, 50%. Why? Brazil, we have a trade surplus with. We export more stuff to them than we buy. This is not the country you want to be hitting with trade sanctions if you're trying to balance trade and build manufacturing. No, it's for what you said. Because President Trump sees failed Kuster, Jair Bolsonaro, the former president, getting some justice in the courts and wants to beat on what could happen to him in the future, for instance. Or you heard a big announcement about new trade deals with the Europeans, with Japan, with Korea. That would roll back existing tariffs of 25% on imported vehicles that we do know have a very low-wage supply chain. Each of those countries' other supply chain partners have low wages. Bulgaria for Europe, Southeast Asia, Cambodia, Vietnam for Japan, etc. Instead of conditioning dropping tariffs from the existing, we have 25% tariffs, and some of this was during Biden, on imported autos. They dropped them to 15%, bad for domestic auto production, extract no higher wages, no labor rights, and here's the kicker, Amy, they have actually 25% tariffs on imported cars from North America, the one agreement that has enforceable labor standards.
Well, let's go, in fact, to the statement that the United Auto Workers released after the U.S. trade deal with Japan was announced. In a strongly worded statement, they wrote, quote, "The UAW is deeply angered by the Trump administration's announced trade deal with Japan. What we've seen so far makes one thing clear. American workers are once again being left behind." They go on to say, quote, "This deal hands a win to transnational automakers that rely on low-road labor practices, substandard wages, excessive temps, and union busting. We need trade deals that raise standards, not reward the race to the bottom. This deal does the opposite," the UAW wrote. So if you could respond to that, Lori, and also I want to ask you about the piece that you wrote earlier this year for the American Prospect, in which you talked about the trade deals that we need. If you could say something about that.
So the UAW is spot on right, and they were reacting particularly to the trade agreement announced with Japan, but the exact same terms have just been hatched with the European Union and also with Korea. Those three trading partners they comprise the vast majority of what is an enormous US trade deficit in automobiles and auto parts. So that actually is an area where there's a legitimate trade action under statute called Section 232 to try and actually fix that. So Trump has rolled that back, the existing penalty for trade cheating. And then the agreements he's made, so the UAW is spot on right, the agreements he's making is using the leverage of those tariffs that he has put in place or threatened to put in place to extract goodies for the usual Republican big corporate constituencies that has nothing to do with rebuilding jobs here or rebuilding our resilience by strengthening our manufacturing sector. And in the article that you can see in the American Prospect or on our website, rethinktrade.org, where we also have a tool that folks at home can use to test each of these agreements, where we basically have an assessor, an evaluator, so you can see here are the things that would be in a good agreement. These are things we need. This would help manufacturing, help balance trade, help US workers, help workers around the world, versus here is stuff that is not in our interest, by the way, cheat. The stuff that's not in our interest has been the center of these agreements. What we need is trade policy being used in combination with other industrial policies so that we do need to rebalance trade. We have $1 trillion trade deficit, as is a prediction of economic theory that has deindustrialized us. We can't make, as we saw during COVID, the basic things we need just to keep our families safe. In an era of climate chaos, we can't have everything made in one place and schlepped across the world dumping carbon fuels. We need to diversify and have redundancy in production. All of those are policies that trade and tariffs can be a part of, but a lot of other tools have to be put in place to actually get the outcomes that you want. And what the Trump administration is doing, basically, is an abuse of the tariff tool. It's not using it for the kind of outcomes that could be strategic, but then using tariffs to threaten countries based on foreign policy, whims based on a particular flattery goal.
Trump keeps saying, we're imposing this tariff on another country, 50% Brazil, whatever. Who actually pays? He suggests it's the country that's going to pay. But in fact, isn't it a tax on American consumers? And also talk about small businesses in this country right now falling apart.
Okay, so here's the thing about the tariffs, which is it is the case that who pays is typically negotiated. So the neoliberal line of it's just a tax, it always gets passed on to consumers is not right. Trump's line of the other country's paying is not right. The true answer is it depends. And what the data is showing, Amy, from the beginning of the imposition of these tariffs, is that right now a lot of the foreign companies, to try and keep the US business, because we do have a $1 trillion trade deficit, the whole world is overly reliant on dumping their stuff in this country. A lot of the other countries, companies, are actually either splitting the costs with the US companies or are eating the costs to be able to keep the market. So we have seen some real price gouging where US companies are raising prices. But in a lot of those instances, the actual price of the tariff, the cost, has already been absorbed by the company that's selling the stuff. So the US companies are price gouging and ripping us off, but they're not necessarily doing that to pay for the tariff. So it depends on what the negotiated outcome is. Practically, the tariff is paid when it comes to the US, it goes into the US Treasury. But who actually foots that bill is negotiated, and so far it's been a lot of the companies in the other countries. It's never the other governments, though. Trump is wrong about that. And as far as, we
have 20 seconds.
As far as what we ought to do going forward, so Trump is not using trade policy in a way to help American workers to raise standards. That needs to be the goal. What we need to do is actually track the actual outcomes and hold them accountable, because politically it's super important. And again, our website at Rethink Trade has an evaluator everyone can use to test these agreements. as they come out.
Lori Wallach, Director of the Rethink Trade Program at the American Economic Liberties Project, board member of Citizens Trade Campaign, host of Rethinking Trade podcast. That does it for our show. I'm Amy Goodman with Nermeen Sheikh. This is Democracy Now!
Well, good evening, and thank you all for coming out. Thank you to the Audio Academy in organizing this event. I'm really happy to be here in the UK talking about my new book, which took me 10 years to write and 100 years of misery to finish. I was going to frame this tonight to talk to you a little bit about what it means to be a human being, because ultimately that's what this book is about. I'll quote from the last chapter. As many of you know, I'm of Hungarian Jewish origin and nearly lost my life at a year of age. And the person who organized that genocidal extinction of Hungarian Jewry was Adolf Eichmann. I'm quoting here from the very last chapter. Prior to his trial for war crimes, the master engineer of Nazi genocide, SS Lieutenant Colonel Adolf Eichmann, was certified as normal by several psychiatrists. More normal at any rate than I am, one of them was said to have explained, according to Hannah Arendt's classic account. Another, Arendt reported, had found that Eichmann's whole psychological outlook, including his relationship with his wife and children, his mother and father, his brothers and sisters and friends, was not only normal, but most desirable. Now that little fact ought to make us consider what the heck normal actually means. Because this is a man who helped to organize the mechanics of millions of people going to their deaths, and he was considered to be normal. So our idea of normal is very much reflective of what you're used to. In a medical sense, there's a normal range of conditions outside of which this life is not possible. So beyond a certain range of temperature or blood pressure or blood acidity, for example, we don't live. So the normal range then is identical with what's healthy and natural. But it's very dangerous to make that assumption that what we consider to be normal in our society is actually healthy and natural. And my argument that it is not. My argument is also that what we consider to be normal is simply what we're used to. And Tolstoy in his Anna Karenina, how does he put it? He says, there's no condition to which a person cannot grow accustomed, especially if he sees that everyone around him lives the same way. From that, it follows that we just think that the way we're living, because we're all living the same way, is just the way it needs to be. And we make our assumptions about life and about human nature itself and existence based on what we're used to. And we don't realize that what we're used to is very much conditioned by particular historical circumstances and social economic factors, the larger political picture, the multi-generational history of our families and our communities. So we just assume that whatever's going on is the only way that life can be. So Thomas Hobbes, the British philosopher in the 17th century, made the famous statement that life is short, nasty, and brutish. He should have said short life, short, nasty, and British, because what he was talking about were the conditions of his time. At the time of the ending of feudalism, the rising of industrial capitalism, the terrible suffering imposed on ordinary people, the class conflict, life seemed that way to him, but he thought he was talking about life in general. He wasn't. He was talking about life in that particular context. And so what we consider to be normal is also comes out of a particular context. And it's based on that context and our experience of it that we make our decisions about what we consider to be human nature, for example. So in this society, it's quite common to say, if somebody's being greedy and selfish, manipulative, dishonest, we'll say, oh, that's just human nature. Interestingly enough, when somebody's being generous and giving and kind,
So that gives that
say, oh, that's just human
water considerably more flow and gets a little bit of detail worked into the figure as well. I'll zoom in on that. Using that tiny brush, it's difficult. Even this pretty tiny face, about the size of a pinky fingernail for the face, proportionate to the body, but that lightens him up and makes him a bit more substantial. Cool. So that's it for the moment. Thanks for watching. That's Adam Sturch podcasting from the Mushroom Mansion, Taos, New Mexico. Working on oil painting butterfly. I'm going to get this centered in and do a detailed photo of that with my brush on it so we can get an idea of scale. I rather like that little head.
Liking what you've got to do. All conditioning
Not bad.
aims at making
Okay,
people
have a good day, Earth.
like there is.